As we mentioned, the first lawsuits have already been filed to block the president's national emergency. One of them filed was by the government watchdog group Public Citizen. According to its press release, it's representing the Frontera Audubon Society and 3 private landowners in South Texas.
And that is because eminent domain, when the government legally seizes private land for public purposes, will be a crucial issue in any border wall construction. Much of the U.S. border where a wall or barricade would go is currently privately owned.
Let's talk more about this now with David Katz. David, a former assistant U.S. attorney, joining us this hour in Los Angeles. David, thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure to be here.
So this whole debate, is this truly a national emergency or not so much? Let's start with the president's own words. Listen closely to how he answers the question from reporter Peter Alexander with NBC News.
I could do the wall over a longer period of time. I didn't need to do this, but I'd rather do it much faster.
Okay, so he didn't need to do this, but said that he wanted to do it much faster, keeping in mind it took the president some 5 minutes to talk through a range of many other issues before even announcing this national emergency. But these plain-spoken words that you just heard legally, how will that play into the challenges that are surely to come against this emergency declaration?
Well, I think the fatal flaw, George, is that it's not an emergency. And everybody can plainly see that. When I was an official in the Reagan administration, we had more than twice as many people cross the border and get caught. It was an intractable problem. Eventually, President Reagan had an amnesty, and it has gotten actually better in those years. There are less people crossing the border. Every year, there are less people crossing the border than there was the previous year. So people say, well, the courts are not going to sit there and fine-tune whether it's an emergency or not, but it's not an emergency. And the other thing is that you hear people say, well, the Supreme Court and the courts have never struck down an emergency. That's true under the new act, but there's a famous case in American history where President Truman seized the steel mills, and that was ruled unconstitutional 6-3 by the Supreme Court. So there's lots of precedent.
So if you would break down the legal vision that the White House is staking out here, David, and the merits of the challenges that are sure to come to this national emergency declaration.
Well, they amended the law in 1976, right after Watergate. It was supposed to ironically limit national emergencies. The idea was that President Nixon had abused them. Unfortunately, it doesn't specifically define what's a national emergency, but it's common sense that if it's not emergent, if it's not a situation like 9/11 was or like the Ebola scare was, if it's not an emergency, it's not an emergency. And if you just can't agree with Congress and persuade Congress, and so you want to snatch more money than Congress will give you, that's not an emergency. Now, the breakdown of how President Trump wants to do it is first he has to say, here's the laws that he's going to amend. Here's the laws that he's going to affect because it's a national emergency. Then Congress votes on it. They pass a joint resolution or they disavow the emergency. It can be expected that the House will promptly disavow the emergency. It'll go to the Senate for them to act on the joint resolution. Let's assume 55 senators say it's not a national emergency. It will have passed both houses of Congress, George. It'll go to President Trump. He'll veto it. There was no point in declaring a national emergency for him to accept that bill. And then 2/3 of each house of Congress would have to override the veto. I don't believe that will happen. The opponents, who are about 70% of the population, don't believe that will happen. That's why already they're going to the courts to get the courts to enjoin it and eventually to stop the spending of money and the exercise of power, because, again, there is no true national emergency.
And as you point out, it does have some Republicans, both in the House and Senate, worried. But both ideological conservatives and Democrats say this sets a dangerous political and even legal precedent. You'll remember before the president made this announcement in the Rose Garden, the House Speaker Nancy Pelosi warned that a Democratic president might have the same call, make the same call on a range of issues, on like climate change or even gun violence. Listen.
You want to talk about a national emergency? Let's talk about today, the one-year anniversary of another manifestation of the epidemic of gun violence in America. That's a national emergency. Why don't you declare that emergency, Mr. President? I wish you would. But a Democratic president can do that.
So again, many of these House and Senate Republicans have made statements on the record legally. How could this come back and bite Republicans in the future?
Well, you know, true conservatives want to conserve the framework of the country and the rule of law, which gives a lot of power to Congress. It gives all the power to Congress in allocating funds. It doesn't give the power of the purse to the president. But now, no matter what the courts rule, President Trump has now acclimated. He's accustomed the population, the people in this country, to expect firm, dramatic action by the president. So if there's a president who's a Democrat and he has an obstructionist Congress, has a Republican Congress that won't pass legislation about the scourge of gun violence. Even today in Illinois, we had another outrage, who won't do anything about what the planet is suffering with, global warming. Then the president will be expected, a Democratic president will be expected by the people to declare a national emergency and to proceed just as President Trump has with this example. That's why the conservatives think it's a very, very bad example. The question is, will they knuckle under to the president?
All right, that was David Katz speaking with me earlier. But again, this certainly sets a precedent, and we'll just have to see where it ends up in the courts.
Absolutely. It's going to be, like we said, weeks, months, who knows?